that you're inclined to do.
E nā iwi, e nā mana, e nā hoa mahi, tēnā koutou katoa. E mihi ana kia koutou, kua tai mai ki te tau toko o tēnei kōpapa. Nā mihi nui, kia Phil O'Reilly, te kai kōrero o te rā, tēnā koe, ko Stro Nittle toko ingoa, o tira noma, haere mai ki te tai ohanga. Welcome, and a very big welcome to our audience. Welcome particularly those online. There are many of you there. A couple of quick health and safety briefings, the most express one you've ever had. So if there's a fire alarm, follow Treasury staff and use the stairs. There are stairs out that way. If there's an earthquake, stay where you are, drop, cover and hold. I know from personal experience that this building is extremely resilient to earthquakes. And if you need a bathroom, yes, head along that path to the kitchenette. Just to the left of there are some doors that say bathrooms, and you will not need a security card to come back. You won't have to go to the ground floor to escape. I am really delighted to have Phil here to talk to us. But the reason why is end of last year, as you know, many of you who follow the Treasury Guest Lecture Series, we had a big push on fiscal policy and some of the fiscal implications. End of last year, we sat down and said, okay, as the government's lead fiscal and economic advisor, where should we go to next? And so the team got together and they said, well, what if this geopolitical stuff seems to be moving a lot? Why don't we have a series on navigating global shifts, resilience, challenges and opportunities? So we thought that was a good idea. And none of us knew just how prescient that was going to be in a way that we had thought about. And so it's just been fantastic. You know, the first thing you say is that we knew that the global environment was changing so fast, and with opportunities and risks for New Zealand, you could see that coming. But things like competitiveness is changing. We thought, okay, if we're a small open economy, if we're just open, that will work for us in a lot of ways. But it's not. You know, these days it's things like we need to be resilient as well. Things like supply chains and risks really matter. But I think the most important thing of opening up this topic was around getting New Zealand to reset its thinking and challenge where we are. And I think this is the power of these Treasury Guest Lecture Series, where we bring together diverse opinions, diverse views, and not only getting the stories and some of the empirics out there, but actually influencing and being influenced in terms of our policy settings. So I am completely delighted to introduce Phil this morning, Order of New Zealand Merit. He's the Managing Director of Iron Duke Partners, a Wellington-based public policy advisory firm. But one of the reasons we were so keen to get Phil to talk to us is Phil really knows business. Phil knows business, the New Zealand business, like no one else. Has a long history here, including a long stint as the Chief Executive of Business New Zealand. But Phil also knows international business and has a distinguished career working internationally in the business sector. So he's held senior government governance roles, including the Board of Business at the OECD, ILO governing body, APEC Business Advisory Council, and he's currently chairs the business at OECD's Southeast Asia Contact Group, sits on the OECD Trade Committee, and has long contributed to the B20, which advises the G20 leaders. So what you get is that depth of both domestic and international business. And then Phil is an unrequited optimist. And so I think what you'll get is some of the opportunities, because I think one of the challenges for us is it's easy for me as an economist to see all the risks and all the downsides. But one of the things that's really struck me is just how responsive our business sector can be and how nimble it can be, and often way faster than governments can move. And in there, I think there is a bit of a lesson. With that, I will turn over to Phil. The way this is going to work is he assures me he's going to make a provocative presentation of about 3/4 of an hour, and then we'll open things up for discussion, which I'm sure will be lively if you're online. Please feel free to put your questions into the chat, and if you have any technical issues, come back to us through the chat as well. But with that, a very big welcome to Phil O'Reilly.
Well, thanks, Drew, and it's an honour and a privilege to be here. I was thinking I've known Struan for a very long time. In fact, I've known Struan, the first time I met Struan was so long ago that we both had bright careers ahead of us at the time. That's a long time, right? And I remember in particular my first meeting here at Treasury, which was more than 20 years ago. I was a newly minted Chief Executive of Business New Zealand. I've been in the role for about a couple of weeks. Treasury obviously high on the first list of government agencies to go meet, and I wasn't really across my brief, as you are in these jobs. And Treasury at that stage had a reputation, I'm not sure it still has today, but it had one then, of if you walked in here and your arguments weren't pretty good and full of evidence, the reaction could be carnivorous. And it was that day with me, I must say. I was told to pack my bag and go away and try again and come back. And I've been coming back for the last 20 odd years now, 21, 22 years now. And I've actually found Treasury to be a marvellous agency, a really incredible agency, because it still has that discipline. You're still going to have an argument, you're still going to have evidence, you're still going to have some ideas. And these days, I find Treasury officials always have a meeting with me. They always listen very carefully, and often they'll do something as a result, and I can't ask for more than that. The second thing I'll say before I start my remarks is this, and I'm pleased that a number of officials are online tonight, today. I'll argue that in New Zealand, we're at one end of the spectrum on this. Actually, I think officials, government officials, are largely the holders of the pen when it comes to long-term public policy quality and public policy thinking. In other countries, that's much more the realm of ministers and politicians, actually. Even in Australia, that's true. But here, I think, for whatever reason, and I won't bore you with my reading of it, but I think officials are the long-run leaders of what good public policy looks like. That's why I'm very keen to talk to you today, and online. There'll be a lot of officials online, and I want to really infect your thinking as much as anything else. And I've dealt with officials intensively for the last 20 years, and I really rate the job that you do. So I'm here as much as anything to support that process. So I want to, this thing's called reglobalisation and the future path to prosperity. I'll talk a little bit about what I mean about globalisation, reglobalisation in a minute or two, but I'll talk a little bit about the approach I'm going to take in this presentation. Firstly, as you've just heard, I'm a global business person. I spend a huge amount of time overseas. This year will be about 90 some odd days. The most intensive year was just the year before COVID, which was 145 days. I spent a huge amount of that time leading international business networks, being a senior member of them. And I've done that for 20 years or so now. As I say, I'm usually, when I'm in those meetings, the only Kiwi in the room, often the only Kiwi in the conference. And meetings of those networks are often at the very pointy end of global business thinking. What I do is I bring those back to New Zealand. I try to report back to officials and today to you. What I'm going to try to do today is first give you an insight as to what I'm seeing in those meetings and in the world I see around me as a result of those networks, and the opportunities that I see for New Zealand as a result. Secondly, I'll cover off a few slogans that we have a bad habit of using about ourselves here in New Zealand, things that we may think are true, but are not, certainly not in the way that international business and even international governments think of us. And those slogans often act as an excuse not to change. So I'm going to cover some of those off. That's my second part of the presentation. Third, I'll talk briefly about what I think we need to do to start changing for the better. In a nutshell, I think we need to make a conscious choice to change, as Struan just said at the start, and to move forward into this new world emerging before us. I'm actually really positive about the world I see in front of me, more positive than I've been for quite a long time, actually, but only if we can get out of our own way as a country, as a business community, as a set of officials, and as governments. And my aim is not to give you a complete list of anything, just a few ideas. I'm not an economist, a bush economist, they call me. Some of the things I say may already be well known to this audience. And my question is, if that's the case, then why aren't we changing already? I'm a student of history. And one of the things that history teaches us is there are times in the world where the balls get thrown into the air, where the preceding certainties of decades or centuries past are disrupted and things feel very uncertain. They become very uncertain in all sorts of ways all at once. It feels very discombobulating. And that's what we're going through now. The end of the certainty of the post-World War II settlement, the Bretton Woods institutions, the modern version of the United Nations, the OECD, and so on. That's being replaced now by something else. But history tells us two things. Firstly, usually parts of the old world remain in the new. And secondly, and this always happens, eventually the balls fall to the ground and we settle upon a new normal, different from what we had, but settled nevertheless. Sometimes, often, it takes a war to settle the new normal. World War II was an example of that. And the settlement we have now that's now going away was the settlement, broadly speaking, that we achieved after the Second World War. Let's hope we don't have to have a World War III to settle things again. Our task as New Zealanders is to make sure that when the balls settle once again to a new equilibrium, that New Zealand is at least as well placed to be prosperous as we were when the balls were thrown into the air in the first place. I think we can achieve that outcome, definitely do, but it'll take new thinking. The balls will be in a different place in the future. I argue that what we're seeing right now is not deglobalising, but reglobalising. The world still wants to trade, or at least the parts of the world that we're increasingly a part of. Southeast Asia, they want to trade. Latin America, they want to trade, absolutely. India, we'll come to them in a minute or two. Even Africa. Africa wants to trade with us. And Europe, even protectionist old Europe, currently our fastest growing trade partner, Europe. Who would have thought that? That's how the world's changing, reglobalising. And much of the world actually still wants to trade according to rules. Any statement you'll see from the international business community will talk about that, including WTO rules. The death of the WTO is much heralded, but to my mind, a long way from happening in reality. I don't see it dying anytime soon. It's changing. But reglobalisation, as I see it, is different from the phenomenon we saw in the 1980s and 90s, for example. New actors are emerging. New realities are becoming much clearer and more pervasive. And we neglect these or ignore them at our peril. We may not like all of them. They may not speak to the world we'd like to see, but they are happening. And most of them actually are opportunities for us, if only we can organise ourselves to take advantage of them. Let me describe a little bit about what I see in terms of reglobalisation. Firstly, with apologies for this slide being a little bit out of date. One of the slogans I see a lot is that global trade as a proportion of global GDP is moderating. Hence the idea that globalisation is slowing or even dying. Peak globalisation, I hear that phrase a bit. The idea of peak, as I say, this slide suggests so on the first reading, you see global trade as a share of global GDP starting to moderate, of course. But actually, most of that's explained by China. As China grows and becomes more developed, it tends to do more business with itself. I was in Shanghai a few weeks ago. Took Didi, that's the local kind of Uber thing. Every Didi I took 20 or 30 of them in Shanghai when I was there. Every one of them, you're driving a domestic Chinese EV. Most brands I'd never heard of before. That's what's going on here. That's what that slide's telling us, right? So they do a lot more business with themselves, as is the case with all of the very large economies. So that's the Chinese story. Now have a look at India. Here's India. Tracking towards global trends off a low base, and therefore a massive opportunity for us. The average age of India is under 30 for the next 30 years. Under 30 for the next 30 years. Is that an opportunity? I think it might be. What do you think? Global trends are interesting for us too. The global trend around trade is interesting for us, but we can sell lots of goods and services offshore still into the future because we don't have to sell to the world. We have to sell to niches. We have to sell to particular countries, particular regions, particular cities, particular industry verticals. So we don't need to sell much in global terms to be prosperous. The opportunities for us are often in the niche, and most of the businesses that I see are successful in the world actually are doing that really, really well. It was reglobalising in other ways too. Digital trade is now leading the way. Have a look at that. That's an example of global connectedness. So if you look at overall trade, slowly rising, but have a look at those two lines on the top. One is digital trade. That's the purple line. And by the way, that ends at 2024, so that does not include AI yet. By the way, that slide. Okay, so that purple line will go further. And the blue line is capital. Capital is the new glue of international trade in a way that we need to understand more. We used to think that the glue of international trade was goods, and that was the case, of course, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Now it's capital and digital, largely services based. So I don't see any slowing down the trend of globalization when it comes to those new pieces of oil of the global economy. Another good news piece for us, trade policy uncertainty is moderating. What's remarkable about this slide is just how trade policy uncertainty was so low before Trump was elected in the United States. And that big spike is, of course, the Freedom Day tariffs announcements of Trump's government. But in fact, we know, those of us in the room who think about these things, we know that the world wasn't all sort of rosy before, and then Trump came along. In fact, the world was a more difficult place to do business for New Zealand. You already see stresses and strains in the global system. And then Trump came along and kind of exploded them a little bit and told a few truths on the way through, by the way. And so what you see is that big spike. Notice how it's now moderating off. And I noticed this, Macron said this the other day in response to another conversation by Trump about tariffs. He said, well, we've got more important things to worry about now. And talking to a very large European business organization, this is a public speech, so I won't tell you they were, you might be able to work it out. They said the first time these Freedom Day tariffs happened, they held an emergency meeting of all their members with what to do about it. Now, when he announces another thing, they finish their dinner and have a chat about it. It's just become part of the new normal for them, right? So global trade uncertainty is still very high, but moderating. That's good for us because it means that companies can now plan with a little bit more certainty than we had previously. It's a new normal. By the way, if Trump goes away, I don't think that moderates. I think we now have a trade policy uncertainty that's going to be at a higher level over a long period of time. We've also got these new growth opportunities that are now part of the world. India, there you go, have a look at that. That's anything above that, the red line, is growth over and above OECD average. That's the Indian growth story there. 6.7% annual GDP, a rising middle class. The middle class in India in the next few decades will be richer than the middle class in New Zealand. Third largest consumer market by 2030. They will increasingly want the things that New Zealand sells. They like us. I've been there on several occasions. The Indian business community increasingly understands the opportunity of New Zealand. Hopefully we'll have a visit by the Indian Prime Minister Modi to New Zealand in the next few months. A massive target, and we just need to align ourselves around the sort of stuff that's going on. Another one for you that people maybe don't think about so much is Vietnam, and I could give you another couple. Henry, I should just acknowledge Henry down the back there, my team member who actually did most of the work on this presentation. I just told him what I thought. He got the data, but I could give you lots of ASEAN countries. I also could give you some African countries that show similar trends, right? Our LATAM countries, Costa Rica probably does a bit of this. So you've got large growth. Median age of 33, manufacturing powerhouse exporting 85% of their GDP. Now, Vietnam wants to be a member of the OECD. They would like to be on the accession pathway, I suspect. It's a bit of a struggle because they're not a liberal democracy. Not really, are they? So, but when you go to Vietnam, what they'll talk about is OECD standard. They want to be at OECD standard, right? So this is a country that wants to follow the rules, that wants to trade with us, that is a massive opportunity for us. If only we could grab them and do business with them, and increasingly, of course, we are. So that's kind of, when you think about deglobalisation, I don't think about it that way. I just think about reglobalisation. I think about new opportunities emerging for us, but we need to focus on them, as I'll come towards in the back of my speech. If we keep on focusing on the old, we'll miss these opportunities, or certainly will underdo them compared to other competitor economies such as Australia. Let me turn to the next bit, which is, as I move around the world, let me talk about some of the new trade realities that I'm seeing that we need to align ourselves to and think about from a human perspective as well. Firstly, the idea of security. Now it's economy-wide. Back in the day, when MFAT was doing trade deals back in the 80s and 90s, trade was at the centre, goods and services trade, classical trade. Now security infects everything. So you'll see much more security activity going on, certainly in the US, but also in Europe. It was an interesting conversation with a set of European trade officials just a few months ago, where we caught up together. It was a great introduction from diplomats here in New Zealand. We did the pleasantries. The first question they asked me: so does New Zealand have any rare earth minerals from Europe? We didn't mention milk and mutton once. I mentioned it. Why don't you take more of our milk? I said. But that's so security. That's what they're interested in, right? They want to know. When talking to European defence primes, they are saying, even if Europe gets to 5% defence spending as a proportion of GDP as they promised, European defence companies won't be able to do it alone. They just don't have the balance sheets. They're going to need others. They're going to need others who can operate at scale with them, or can operate in the niches. They're actively looking out at partners in countries like ours who can help them, particularly countries like the Five Eyes, who they can feel good about in a defence and security relationship. There's a trading relationship in there that's quite new to us, that we've kind of said no to in the past. We've been concerned about separating defence and trade a bit. That's not the case now. What that leads a whole bunch of negatives for us, and that, of course, protectionism masquerading as security. we're going to levy your steel, or we're going to limit aluminium, or we're going to have a problem with your computer chips because of security. So protectionism masquerading as security. Special treatment of national security champions is a bit of a problem. You're seeing that a bit all over the world, as a matter of fact. And then, of course, more pervasive restrictions, as I say, in areas like digital and steel, masquerading as defence policy. But the positives are increased defence spending in many partner economies, and that's an opportunity for us, as I say, particularly with crossover civilian and defence technologies. That's the SIOS example is the most famous example in New Zealand, but there are many others as well. Crossover civilian defence technologies that are now available to us and being pushed forward. The implication of that is a much stronger partnership between government and business in those target markets, because you don't buy defence just because some punter turns up. You'd have to be introduced by the government and so on to do that. And of course, space. Here's an interesting thought for you. Who launched the most rockets into orbit last year? United States. Who was second? China. Who was third? New Zealand. The European Union knows that. They're upset about it. They're unhappy about it. They want to launch more. And I was in a meeting with them the other day, some of the senior guys there, and I tried to put up my hand and say, we're beating you, you know. They didn't want to hear that. So, but, you know, that's kind of an example of an opportunity we've now got that we really need to focus on. Next one, that's kind of interesting in the global debate right now, of course, is resilience. It's a new fundamental, also often actually an excuse for protectionism, but it's everywhere. Supply chains, food nationalism, oil, of course, defence, cybersecurity, climate, critical minerals, steel and cement, shipbuilding. You may have seen the other day that the US has leased, on a 99-year lease, a piece of the Philippines, largely around critical minerals extraction. That's what resilience looks like in the world right now. Radical stuff that we would never consider be a good idea in New Zealand, but nevertheless it's happening out there, right? So it's fundamentally altering many of the trade realities. The OECD talks about that as economic security. So you'll see it referenced in many ways. It goes to the idea that just in time is all over, largely, and it means that, you know, now just in case we're doing it with putting more oil storage into Marsden right now. So, and that's expensive. The problem with that, it's expensive. But also, it's probably not great for us because we're at the end, the small country at the end of a long supply chain, which kind of goes against the idea of resilience. So this resilience idea is probably not all that helpful for us, except in digital data and so on, where we could play a part, and probably should think about doing that. Next one, trust. Those same trade officials in Europe, talking to them, I said, "Are we a trusted partner of you?" They said to me, I don't know if I'm hurting a confidence here, but I won't mention their names. But one of them said to me, "Yeah, for we used to think you always talk to us about trust, and we used to think that was quaint, and we don't now." Right? Another example, a conversation with a very senior official in a Gulf state, where I said, "Is New Zealand a strategic partner for you for food?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Why is that? We don't sell you much food." He said, "Well, Phil, when you sell us some food, you send what you said you were going to send on time, and the bill that you send is the bill we agreed at the time." That's how they define trust, right? And this is an era, of course, where food nationalism during COVID really impacted many of the Gulf state economies. So this idea of trust matters now. So we shouldn't take it for granted. We shouldn't put it at the bottom of the list of 20 things that we have that's in our interest now. Actually, now it goes to the very value of our strategic partnerships with countries. So trust is defined as the following when I think about it, when I hear about it globally. We follow the agreed rules. We do what we say we'll do. We don't change the rules unilaterally. We send the agreed bill upon delivery. We work to understand each other's needs. And that plays out not just in trade, but also in defence. It plays out in the social space. It plays out in culture. It's a key part of our reputation in the world that we've underdone in the last couple of years. We've taken it for granted. Don't take it for granted now. It matters deeply, deeply, deeply now. The international organisations I was asked to speak about these, they're reforming. Largely, some of them might die. Some of them, personally, I might not be too worried about that, actually. But when you think about the truly big ones, they're reforming, they're not dying. And so some of that may lead, if that reform effort is unsuccessful, it may lead to them being irrelevant. But some of them were becoming irrelevant anyway before these changes. They were being hollowed out. So if you think about something like the WTO, actually, if you looked at the last ministerial there, actually they are involved in a pretty serious reform effort. If you talk to them in Geneva, they are actually attempting now to move forward with the support of the United States, as a matter of fact, as far as I'm aware. The ILO, that I'm close to, the International Labour Organization based in Geneva, I'll just be there in a few weeks' time, slimming down, getting less funding, but slimming down. And actually, that's probably a good thing. They're so slimmed down to their core task and mandate as they've become a little bit kind of fattened over the years with increased funding. Some of that's going away. Similarly, the OECD, really, trying to think about these new realities. So when I deal with them, and I deal with many of them, what I see is this: as I say, they're slimming down. What they're also doing is retaining space for conversation. This is critically important for New Zealand. They're trying to put a flag on the hill to say, what are we trying to do here? And as much as anything, what they're trying to do is keep the conversation going. They're trying to make sure that we agree on what we agree on, even if it's less than we used to. They're informing the debate. They're attempting to bring evidence and information to the debate. And the one I'm closest to, the OECD, does that a lot. They're working with coalitions of the willing, an idea I'll come back to in a minute or two. They're trying to keep this global show on the road. Does that sound familiar to you? New Zealand does that really well. We do soft power really, really well. So we can play a part in this. In my kind of knowledge of these organisations, we are playing a part. Claire Kelly is now, I think, the president of the WTO, or a very senior person of the WTO right now. That's really massive for us, and shows this trust thing that we have going for us. We shouldn't take that for granted. Next thing I'm seeing is coalitions of the willing. A big new part. Well, I'm big now. We've been doing it for years, of course, in New Zealand. I put on 3 there. CPTPP, of course, was originally the P4. Those of you in the room who know that: Brunei, Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore. Now the subject of an explicit partnership with the EU around trade and investment, and much more besides. That's how big that can get. Probably the largest multilateral trade agreement in the world, and likely to expand more, I suspect. Deeper, the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement started with New Zealand, Chile, and Singapore, the original signatories. Now you've got Korea, Costa Rica, Peru. The accession working groups currently underway for Canada, China, UAE, El Salvador, Ukraine, Uruguay, and Thailand. And I know the EU is also interested in this. So these coalitions of the willing are a new way forward. And in fact, when you think about WTO reform, one of the things I think may well happen is more of this idea of coalitions of the willing. What is, in fact, consensus in an organisation like the WTO? It's not unanimity. It's a different thing. So how do we move forward? And I think New Zealand, when I hear about these coalitions of the willing, and I insert my New Zealand accent into the conversation, people look at me and nod because they know we're good at that. They know we're really good at that. Is building these coalitions of the willing, trying something new because we can. We're not very powerful in the world. We have no real power. I make the point to people when I talk to them, if we don't like you, what are we going to do? Speak harshly? We don't have a battleship. So, what are we going to do about that? So we're good at that kind of, that soft power. So that's a big opportunity for us. I think we should do more with it. And I know Vangelis and MFAT officials are. AI, then quantum, I use this idea. Here's 2 quotes from people who should know what they're talking about. CEO of Microsoft saying it's not taking jobs away, and our old mate Elon saying all jobs will go. So that's how much we know about AI right now, right? When I think about AI for the future, AI adoption, there's an old slide for you that's only, it's second half of 2025, it'll be out of date already. Any company that tells you that they know what they're doing with AI, they're wrong. They don't. Nobody knows what we're doing with AI just yet. It's an emerging technology. It's one of those things we'll look back in 10 years' time and say, gee, that changed everything, but it doesn't feel like it at the moment, right? So, and then of course you've got quantum coming up. And I come to this point about it missing opportunities because we did it. Australia is already making $1 billion plus bets on quantum. What are we doing? Nothing much anyway. We're thinking about it. We might put $1 million in or do something, or try and get a bit of a partnership to spend some Australian dollars. We're just not making a bet on it as a country, and we need to. It's going to be a pervasive technology. We need to think about what it means for us. So that's a big part of the business conversation. As I say, anybody that tells you they know what's going on, don't believe them, they're wrong. Industry policy. Industry policy is the conversation going on around the world right now. In fact, the OECD ministerial that will take place in Paris in just a few weeks' time has at its core, chaired by the Finns, by the way, New Zealand's the vice chair of that thing, has at its core industry policy, because it's the debate. Have you heard the debate in New Zealand yet about industry policy? No, we're not having that debate at all. We are the only country in the world not having that debate about industry policy in the context of what it all means and what we can do with it, right? It's the big game in town. Basically, every country is doing something. Have a look at the Australian budget just announced last night, $1 billion plus for Australian manufacturers to improve resilience. Industry policy at its core, probably just a bit of lazy protectionism too, I guess, but we'll have you can take a view on that. It has lots of forms, industry policy, direct subsidies. Here's an example of an industry policy I agree with, just to get this in your head. Should European governments spend more on European domestic defence capability? Yep. Yeah, they should. They shouldn't rely on America anymore, right? That's just obvious. And that's an industry policy that requires a government pointing to the sector to say you need to grow. But we couldn't disagree with it, right? If a government subsidises an out-of-date steel mill on the basis that it's a resilience thing. No, that's just subsidies, right? So you can this industry policy thing is, we shouldn't just go, oh, we shouldn't do industry policy. My point is, what does good industry policy kind of look like? Because actually we do some of it in New Zealand, as I'll talk about in a minute. Direct subsidies, it can be border measures like a carbon border adjustment mechanism for steel or cement. The Europeans are talking about one for food now. Could be government support, procurement, that's the defence policy thing. Government or public investment, could be investment in port facilities or data centres. This is massive in Southeast Asia. Import or export restrictions, as you're seeing in the US and other places as well. So industry policy takes a variety of forms. So we shouldn't just say, oh, industry policy, it's all subsidies. No, it's not. There's more to it than that. And it also has a number of drivers. Takes place for a variety of reasons. Security concerns, I've just talked about. Building investment certainty. That's the idea of special economic zones, for example. Greening the economy. There's a lot of industry policy around that. Geopolitical concerns, of course. The idea that we need to have our own resilience, and so we need to invest in it on that basis. Reaction to other industry policies, so they've got one, so we need one to compete with them. Good old-fashioned protectionism, and an emergence of winner-takes-all players. A good example of that is the tech companies in the US, massive companies, of course. Europe is actively saying, no, we need our own tech heroes, otherwise we'll become beholden to the Americans. That's what you're seeing, a lot of European investment and planning around how they create their own tech heroes. It happened 30, 40 years ago with Airbus versus Boeing. That's exactly the same idea, just in the digital era. So industry policy takes place for a whole bunch of reasons. Now, I'm with anybody in this room. I'm cautious about all of this. But to say we shouldn't debate it, we shouldn't have a view on it, is just wrong. We should. Here's an example of how it works. Space. Who would have thought that we would be the third largest launcher of rockets? I wouldn't have thought that. But we invested, Stuart will tell me if I'm wrong, we invested something less than 100 million in the space sector. And now we've got a burgeoning space sector with lots of companies down in Mahia, a global reputation that we can utilise. There's a great example of industry policy. We just didn't think about it. We feel as though our hands are a bit dirty diving into it. That's the problem, right? We need to stop that thinking and ask ourselves more logically about what we're doing and why, because otherwise we'll underdo it. I'll come back to that. Here's an example of what I think we could do as industry policy in New Zealand. Science. We underinvest in science. There's the OECD average, and there's New Zealand in R&D expenditure. We are pathetic at it, and we've talked a big game about it in New Zealand, but successive governments have never actually invested in it. I'll argue that if we were to just go match the OECD average for 10 years, we would be a much wealthier country. Other small open economies, nearly all of them, have done that with great success. We just have not, and it's a major problem for us. I think if I was to think about one big thing government could do, I'd do that. Banning bicycles would be the other one. Ban bicycles, but also do this. Get our science investment up to the OECD average, not just, by the way, in business-ready science, doing it everywhere. Blue sky science, investigator-led, the Marsden Fund, all the way through to very close to business, the D part of R&D. Here's some potential examples. I was chatting to one of my favourite. New Zealand's full of cool little things that happen you don't know about. One thing I do know about is, I think, called the Product Accelerator in Auckland, which does nothing more than stick business people with scientists. That's all it does. It's a marriage sort of thing. It operates out of the Auckland University campus on Kaipa Pass Road. It took, I think, $2 million of government funding last year. Amazing. For no money, this thing happens. And they do some work on, I was just talking to them about that. I said, could I use your stuff in the speech? And so they said, yes. Here's some examples of platforms they're thinking about, which, but for lack of funding, we could be doing more with, right? So geothermal energy innovation. How about pulling out rare earth minerals from steam? That's what they're working on. How about things like engineering technologies in extreme environments? Last time I looked, New Zealand has quite a big footprint in Antarctica, the most extreme environment in the world. What about bio-based engineering products? That's about taking nutraceuticals from trees, that sort of stuff, right? Now, that might all be wrong, but can you see it's worth the debate? It's worth having a think about. The 60 million the government invested in drilling for supercritical geothermal outside Taupo, I think that's a good idea. Let's do that, because if we can crack it, then we'll have an industry that we can export globally. It could be our nuclear. I agree with Ian Taylor on that matter. So that could be our industry policy. There's a thought for an idea for you today. I want to now talk about, see the opportunities. You excited? I am. I get excited about these opportunities as I move around the world. And then I come back to New Zealand and we tell ourselves some myths. Now, as I go through these myths, I don't want this to be a sort of a downer on New Zealand. There's a lot of things we do really well that are massively important to us. This trust thing, the fact that we're not corrupt, all that sort of stuff. These matter deeply to us in international markets. But the reason I raise some of these myths, and not all of them, is that they tend to shut down debate. They tend to shut down imaginative solutions. They become slogans. And by doing so, they reward and sustain incumbents. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Some incumbents I really like and they're good, but we should at least understand what we're doing and why, because in the absence of thinking about that, we tend to sustain incumbents. So in my experience, whenever we talk about these things, we tend to come to some of these myths and they tend to close down debate. Here are some of them. We're a great place to do business. I'm sorry, no, we're not. We are not a great place to do business. There we are. That's just one. We could pull out 1 million of these from the OECD. That's economy-wide product market regulation. 2018, I know it's an old number. We've probably got worse, actually. OECD average is in green, New Zealand's in red. We are slightly worse than the OECD average. Nothing to see here. Oh, come to New Zealand. It's an easy place to do business. No, it's not. So when I talk to international business people, I go, no, you're middle of the rank in most of these things. And we make it worse on ourselves when we try to come up with kind of regulation that we think is really, really good, but is not aligned with anyone else. Okay, and so we've got a single economic market with Australia where we're supposed to be aligning regulatory outcomes. I work closely. I'm a director of an Australian-based business, Oricon. When I look across the Tasman, what I see is we make it harder for businesses in Australia to invest in New Zealand because we don't align our regulation with Australia, even if that would be a sensible outcome. And we're supposed to have this SEM thing. Okay, so it's a myth to say we're an easy place to do business. It's a myth. Next, we're open to investment. I'm sorry, that's wrong as well. We were actually, until the recent reforms pushed forward by David Seymour, we were actually the least permissive regime in the OECD. When I talked to the OECD people about that, they said it's because you're puzzle palace, my words, not theirs. It's really hard to work out what the decision's going to be. At least that's kind of been sorted out. So now we're kind of middle of the pack. Now there are some, Libya is at the left-hand side, who wants to invest in Libya? There are some that are much worse than us. China, for example, is much worse than us. The problem is that you have to invest in China. You don't have to invest in New Zealand, right? So we need to be way down here, right? Now we have some of our competitors, Germany, Latvia, Sweden, Ireland, all down there. Okay, so that's once again, that's also a bit of a myth that we're open to investment. And here's another one. I didn't write this down. I thought of it this morning, actually. I should have written it down for you. Sovereign risk. We have low sovereign risk in New Zealand. That's not what the international business community thinks. The international business community knows that the oil and gas exploration ban that was announced by a previous government has damaged our reputation. Now, maybe it has or maybe it hasn't. Maybe objectively, we're low sovereign risk. That's not what investors think. They just told me a few weeks ago, I was talking to one of them about sovereign risk, and he said, yeah, that raised the oil and gas ban. It's an excuse, no doubt, but nevertheless, it's there. It goes to the fact that there's plenty of places to invest other than New Zealand. We need to have a shining case to invest. Otherwise, they just go to the normal, right? They just go off to China or India or whatever, right? Australia. So we need to have a shining case, and we don't. That's the point I'm making here. It's a myth that we're open to investment in quite that way. Middle of the pack at best. We punch above our weight. No, we don't. Here's the FDI stock, foreign direct investment stock, a ranking with the OECD. This is from Minister Todd McClay's speech at the opening of Invest New Zealand, right, Henry? So we rank 27 out of 38 in stock of foreign direct investment in New Zealand. Our annual net FDI inflows are 31 out of 38, and our outwards FDI is 34 out of 38. We do not punch above our weight. Now, that's not true in one sense. Individuals punch above their weight, and in some things we do, some companies we do, some policies that we have, we punch above our weight. The problem that we have in New Zealand is that we then extrapolate that to the whole of New Zealand. Oh, because we've got Rocket Lab, because we've got Xero, because we've got these hero companies out there, we punch above our weight. No, we don't. No, we don't. And it's a myth that gets in our way. And it gets in our way because we get lazy about not making change. Here's another one for you. We are nimble. We're not nimble. Everybody knows that our RMA and the way in which we plan is terrible. Now, most other countries are bad too. We're not uniquely bad at planning law, believe me. Go to Ireland, see how you go. Go to much of Europe and see how you go. The point is, we are no more nimble than many others. Now, that's not to say we're not nimble in some areas. Stuart mentioned the fact that it is true, by the way, I agree with this, that in some markets and some companies that you see incredible nimbleness going on, people getting into a little niche, And I visit them occasionally, and I wish I could visit them more often, and they're doing amazing stuff. And I think, gee, that's really clever what you're doing there, but it's a tiny part of what we're doing, all right? So if you think about us as a country, the way in which we write laws, the way in which we think about regulation, we are not nimble. We don't pick winners, my favourite. Here's a picture that illustrates the two big winners we pick in New Zealand. For those of you who know this is from the beautiful carpet. you'll know that this is Wellington Airport international arrivals. There's the beagle sniffing the baggage. Illustrates two big winners that we pick. We pick agriculture and tourism, and that picture encapsulates the two of them, right? I know we pick them because in New Zealand, if you bring an apple in that bag, you'll get arrested. That won't happen in Singapore. You'll get arrested if you bring a drug in that bag. All right. So they chose societal cohesion and all that sort of stuff. We chose agriculture. And let's not kid ourselves that we did. By the way, I don't disagree with it. It's a great idea. Made us rich. I'm for it. It's fantastic. It's wonderful. Fonterra, without Fonterra, we'd be a real bad productivity story. We got a bad one now. It'd be worse without Fonterra. So but let's understand we picked it. We have public research organisations pointing it to. We've got 2 universities pointing towards it. We've got we've got a whole agency, MPI, over the road here pointing at it. So let's not believe that we didn't pick it. We picked it as a winner, and it did us proud. But we shouldn't think that somehow that's not a winner, because otherwise what will happen is all we'll do is keep on picking it. We need to understand that was a winner we picked. And if we're going to go think of something else, we're going to go pump up some other part of the economy, then we need to take a deliberate approach to doing that. Because otherwise all we'll do is continue to pick winners like agriculture and tourism. And tourism's the same, right? Tourism's the winner that we picked. I can understand why we picked it. Tourism is a classic example of lots and lots of thousands and thousands of small businesses who don't have the capacity to get together and market themselves offshore. So I can completely understand why, and particularly in New Zealand, one of the most beautiful countries in the world, and a hard place to get to. It's not easy to get here. It's expensive and so on. I can completely understand why we picked it. It's a good idea. It's a great thing. I think we picked a great thing there, but we picked it. Okay, so don't tell me we don't pick winners in our economy, and don't tell me also that we don't do corporate welfare. We do plenty of it, plenty of it. The point I'm making is not to criticise it or praise it. The point I'm saying is we need to recognise it, because only if we recognise it will we be able to change. Because if we don't change, all we'll continue to do is pick agriculture and tourism, and that's almost, we should continue to pick it, by the way. I'm not suggesting we ignore it. But unless we think more openly and more honestly about some of the other things we could do and make a bit of a bet on them as we did with agriculture and tourism, we're going to get in trouble as a country, I think. Enough of that stuff. I could tell you a million other things we are myths, but I won't bore you with them today. What should we do now as a result of all of this? Some final thoughts for you. The point I'm making is the world ahead of us is full of opportunities. If only we can seize them. We need to align ourselves to seize them. The world is friendly to us. Vietnamese people love us. Indian business people get along well with us. Okay, we're good. But we need to seize these opportunities. This is a job that we need to do. So here's what I think we should do. It's not radical. It's not we should come up with a ministry of everything or we should change everything we do. It's much more about we should put the new possibilities at the centre. We've got a bad habit. It's an entirely understandable habit, but it's a bad one, that we do all the normal things Monday to Friday, and we think about the new things on Tuesday between 2 and 4, if you like, right? In other words, that we put them as an add-on to the busy work that we're already doing. No, we need to put these new things at the centre of what we think about. We need to spend a lot more time and effort on them. And that starts by number one, and by the way, that's number 1 through 6. It's number 1 and then some fresh air. Number 1, we need to be brave and take a reform mindset. That's what we're lacking. We're lacking a reform mindset. That's why I welcome this Treasury process, and I welcome the engagement of officials here, because it's officials that will actually derive a reform mindset in terms of the advice they give ministers and governments and others too. We need to develop new global foresight and insight, geography-based and sector-specific. A lot of our foresight and insight is based on the old world that we see, all right? We need to have much more global foresight and sector-specific stuff based on the new world. The business community is okay at this, but actually also pretty poor, I think. They're too small, and they're not. We don't have the think tanks and the kind of economic stuff going on in New Zealand in order to enable this to occur. It's just the nature of a small economy. It's going to fall to government to do it in association with the business community. What I'm talking about is a much more joined-up effort to try and understand those opportunities, where they are and what they are. That's just foresight and insight. Thirdly, we need to develop a clear-headed view about what opportunities are really available to us and what barriers we face to utilising them. This is an example. In the absence of a structure, what we tend to think is every bright idea that we hear of in Wellington or in the public debate is the same as every other idea, right? So there's the idea, you read the paper today, there'll be hundreds of these ideas. We could just do this, we could do that. For every complex solution, there's usually a bright, shiny, simple solution that's wrong, right? So you see a bunch of that stuff. If only we did this. I was guilty of one earlier on talking about science, but I think I'm right. So So we need to, the only way we'll get through the idea of getting through the thicket of bright ideas that just are wrong to good ideas that might actually work is to developing a clear-headed view about what New Zealand's competitive advantages actually are, what can we do, what are the things we should probably invest in that are a bit new and a bit brave. Then, as I say, resource allocation, we need to really make better choices about allocating our intellectual policy and fiscal levers towards them. I think to any senior official listening into this, where are your best and brightest in your agency actually pointing right now? I bet they're pointing back at the old, right? I bet. What about pointing at the new? That's how you actually make change. You allocate resource and brains at the new and bravery at the new. You say the way to get ahead, actually the new. Think about the new opportunities that we've got here. Not to say we're dissing the old. That's important to us, right? And then decide what measures are needed for success. This is another classic. Do we need a regulatory change? A good example of that's mining and refining rare earth minerals. We're having a debate about that in New Zealand. Now, you might agree that we should mine them and refine them. You might disagree, but at least we should have a debate based on that, rather than some slogan to say we don't like mining or whatever. That's a silly debate to have. We need to have a much more debate about saying what's the clear-headed view we've got here, and then make a decision about whether or not New Zealand's actually open for doing this, and in what area, what with what minerals, and so on. That's actually the right debate to be having. Is it about industry policy? Do we get into industry policy on high tech, for example, in the space sector? I would argue actually we already are. We probably should be braver about saying we're going to. Or is it about improved diplomatic and business cooperation, for example, India, where I think a big key to unlocking India is diplomatic and business cooperation and really going to market with the right kind of talent. And that's actually what happened with China. One of the reasons we were so successful in exploiting the free trade arrangements with China was that the government of Helen Clark and later John Key really got together with the business community and took New Zealand to market in a very joined up way. I was part of that, and it was very inspiring to see, actually. And then we need to, the other sort of really important point is we need to tell the story to the public. We need to engage the public in a reformist mindset. Because otherwise, I think we won't inspire them, and they'll tend to, the public debate will tend to go back to the old, and go back to this narrow view of the world rather than the wide view. So there's some bravery necessary in telling the story to the public. And all of those things I'm talking about, I think, should be developed in cooperation with the business community and others too. I mean, other people as well who might have an impact, but certainly those with the balance sheet need to be close to this. Next point I'll make is this. We need to maintain existing networks and build new ones. We need to emphasize trust in you. We need to understand that in this new world, trust matters more than we ever thought it did, more than it ever has before, actually. We need to emphasize trust in you. Remain committed to the multilateral institutions. Anybody that tells you we should walk away from that we should disinvest in the multilaterals, that's wrong. We need to invest more heavily now than ever. I certainly am. We need to make sure that when the multilaterals resettle themselves, that we are more influential on them then than we have been in the past. And that'll be a tough ask because we're pretty influential on them right now. Focus on coalitions that are willing. This is not just coalitions that are willing around diplomacy. And I know MFAT, the Trade Negotiations Division, does a big job here, but it's also coalitions that are willing around things like innovation, coalitions that are willing around things like science. The Horizons Research Fund in Europe's a good example of this. We should sort of take a view that says we really do need to focus on these things. What do we focus on to actually expand the dollar that we're spending in New Zealand into $1,000 because someone's spending the other 999 or doing something like that? And then use existing areas of leadership to build new relevance. I take the example of Antarctica, where New Zealand's had a leadership role for decades now in Antarctica. Antarctica is now contested ground, as we all know. Geopolitically, it's contested ground, much more than it ever has been. What's our view on that? How can we show a leadership role there? We've already got an established leadership role. How can we show new leadership there to make sure that we are building new relevance off these old things that we've taken for granted potentially over the last few decades? I'll finish with this. I said at the start, the balls are in the air. They won't be that way forever. We've got a limited time to realign what we do, how we think and how we invest to make sure that that new world that settles itself, when that settles, that we're set up to be successful well for that new future. I'm confident we can do it. I know we can do it. But in order to do it, most of all, we need to change ourselves. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. That was absolutely fantastic. So now you get the opportunity to ask the questions that by that I don't think you ever will be. So ask questions of Phil. We've got half an hour or so to do that, so I welcome it, and I will moderate from those of you who are online as well. But do I want to open up something? Let me make a comment first, I guess, just I guess a question, a part of the question for you, because I think you made the same point, which is one of my observations is that in some of New Zealand's strengths, we take them for granted, and therefore we forget about them rather than leveraging them as real opportunities. And you talked about trust. That's one of my ones as well. But do you want to just elaborate, or do you think I'm right?
That's absolutely right. When I join international business organisations, you see this in diplomacy as well, by the way. Oftentimes, I'm pushed to the forward, I'm pushed to the front. Right now, that part of that's my own ambition and the ambition of the New Zealand sort of milieu, if you like. But when I ask people about why that is, here's what they say. One, well, Phil, if you cock it up, well, you're a Kiwi, who cares? So there's a bit of that, so you're small and therefore it doesn't matter much if there's a mistake. But much more than that, they tell me things like, you speak English as a first language, you are friends with everyone and enemies of none, right? So the Africans like us because they want to gain wealth through agriculture, and we gain wealth through agriculture. They are powerless, we are powerless. We don't speak at them, we speak with them, right? This is particularly the Anglophone Africans. The Latin Americans like us because we're in their part of the world. We're in the southern end. The Argentinians in particular love us. They speak really highly of us. We like the same sport and so on. So we're immediately approachable. And I think so if you add to that sophistication, we're in a very powerful position. What we often lack is sophistication. We often lack that capacity to utilize and to exploit that opportunity that we've got. But a lot of that's based on trust, and we are trusted. It's a huge part of the new normal, and we mess that up at our peril. We don't.
Goes to one of the questions online. So, but can trust also become a euphemism for friendshoring and bloc politics?
You can. I hate friendshoring. You heard about friendshoring? We should do business with our friends, and that's a government thought, right? And I push against it all the time. The reason I push against it is that's the government telling me who my friend is. Do you believe that for a second? Right. So the European Union does a lot of business with Qatar. I'm criticising Qatar particularly, but last time I looked, they don't have a perfect human relations record, right? They don't have a perfect human rights record, Qatar. They're not a democracy, and yet we're our friends, are they? I mean, we do business with them. It's that sort of thought. Now, that's not intended as a criticism of Qatar. The point is, who are your friends as a government is a very different thing to who your friends are as a business. When I push back at that, I say businesses tend to do business with people they trust, who they know the stuff I've just talked about. They send the bill, we get paid, and so on. And that often leads to wider collaboration. And then sometimes it leads to friendship. We need to think about the world we're in that case, right? So I don't want government to tell me who my friends are. What I want government to do is actually open the doors for me into these big new economies, which MFAT's doing a brilliant job of, so that I can actually find companies to trust in this new world. So that's not government's role to tell me who my friends are. It's government's role to try and open up opportunities for me to find partners I trust. So that's kind of where I get to on that issue. Where government trust helps is in this new world of opening doors. But one of the trends I'm seeing in, say, defence, but you're seeing it elsewhere, is the need for government and business to be much more closely aligned. Many of these new trade opportunities, we used to say, when you turn up in a new market, you talk to the NZTE person, they'll give you your introductions while you go. That still works a bit, but actually what we're now needing is NZTE folk and ambassadors to be much more actively introducing and partnering businesses in, because you're now dealing with things like defence where you have to have those relationships. Those are the new ways of doing business that I think about.
Thanks, Phil. Let me take a question from the room. I've got some great questions online, but does somebody want to open up? Or yeah.
Phil, we've worked on Latin America in the past. My question is not about Latin America, but about science, because of the different role of Victoria University at the moment. How do you think the science reforms are progressing, and what needs to happen since? So the government is making changes, universities, industries responding, but how much does the broader business community see the science opportunity?
So just for the information, so there were those two twin reviews that Sir Peter Gluckman led, one on the science system, on the university system. I was on the university side, so those recommendations are now there. I was very closely allied to the science review, though. Some of the science review was very sensible. We had too many small CRIs with limited balance sheet opportunities, and they were kind of hyper competing with each other. So the idea of pushing them together, getting a bigger balance sheet heft and getting more kind of strategic heft. The science system was also hugely overgoverned inside the CRIs, but you had lots of supervisors running around. So no criticise the supervisors, but that's the nature of these things. So the idea of crunching them together and creating a more coherent and a bigger whole is a good idea. The idea that they are then trying to collaborate with universities a little more sensibly is another good idea, I think. One of the things I noticed, though, is that the new PROs will have quite a big task to make themselves relevant to business. You see a little bit of that. You used to see a bit of it in some of the CRIs, and you see some of it in the PROs. But if I talk to the average business person, even if I talk to a science-based business, and I said, do you work with the PROs? They go, not really, not really. That's why the Product Accelerator in Auckland is so important. Because if a business person turns up to the Product Accelerator, some person's going to say, hey, you need to talk to Dr. Dave Smith. He is at the Geosciences PRO. And that's how that translational front door capability is lacking. So I think one of the big jobs of the new PROs is to get out there and actually explain to business what they do and make it easy for business to deal with them. It's a lost opportunity right now. And of course, the other thing that happened was the government reformed them and didn't give them any more money. So I think it's definitely an opportunity lost. Hence my slide to say we just need to, that should be our industry policy in New Zealand, invest in science a lot, because that'll actually help us a lot.
The gentleman over here has got a question, I think.
Thank you. I'd like to follow on from the previous question. I've had my career at Victoria University at Wellington in the very much applied one, and we met up. I was still am a founding investigator in Product Accelerator.
Right.
So I have extensive experience with industry and led a number of large research projects, both industry oriented and R&D funded by MBIE funding. And then these have led to a number of startup companies, and I'm currently the CEO of one and sit on the chair of the board of another. Now, the biggest challenge here is the translation of new science and technology into reality in the industry. The New Zealand industry, and this is a general statement, so again, like you qualified your statements, Phil, is the risk. Large corporates are risk adverse, largely because they have to return a dividend to shareholders.
Right.
Risk poses a risk to that. When you're translating new R&D process product development, there is a risk. And that's where it's often called the valley of death. So I haven't seen anything in the new science and technology area to address that. Interested in your thoughts on this.
It's an ongoing issue in many countries, and particularly as where capital markets and angel investor markets are shallow. But lots of countries have not cracked that quite. So the value of death refers to the idea the company grows a little bit, needs an investor and gives a full data. And after a while, if it had a more provable product, it gets some more investors, hence the value of death, right? And there's been a bunch of interventions by the New Zealand government in that, product accelerators and God knows what, and support for angel investors and so on. One of the things that I think, I'm not sure we're ever going to solve it, but one of the things I think that I had in my speech notes, I didn't say it, so let me say it now. I think we get really muddled thinking about the science system. Here's one. We seem to think that whenever something comes out of the science system, we should sell it to a New Zealand firm. That's crazy. Why are we doing that? Why don't we sell it to the world and make money and make a reputation, and then the world will come and invest in us? Isn't that a good idea? That's how the Americans do it. That's how the Europeans do it. Why do we take a nationalistic view of the science that we make? That's crazy. So one of the solutions, I think, is to take a much more activist global approach to, so who wants to buy the science? We're going to sell the science. Even if we sell it for $1 and someone else makes $1 million in 30 years' time, we still sell it for $1. We're good. We can divest that $1, right? The second thing I'd say is my sense is that we are getting better at some of these issues. Invest NZ, I think, is an opportunity, because the global investors we see coming to the market, if only we could get them pointed towards some of these things, I think will be investors, because they've invested and succeeded in those things in the past. But I don't think we're ever going to solve it if we think about New Zealand Inc. We need to think globally about how we bring pools of capital to New Zealand. If I was, another good example of that, if I was involved in a space startup in New Zealand right now, I bet you I'd have more interest. I don't know this to be true, but I bet you I'd have more international interest because of Space Lab, because of Rocket Lab, right, because of what's happening at Mahia. So my sense is that goes back to this point about, are we thinking about where we've got real opportunities and making sure we set those things up well to succeed? And then if there's a bright idea that comes out of some research of Vic and they can get training, that's great, but you're not going to be able to solve every problem. So I hope it's a confusing answer, but I hope that gives you some idea.
It's still a challenge.
Yeah, no, exactly. I don't think we're going to solve it.
Let me take us back up
Thank you.
to one of the questions online. So when you talked a lot about the concept of reglobalisation,
Yep.
do you think that's a general reconfiguration, or are we just watching firms root around Trump while we're waiting him out? In other words, in 4 years, do we look back at 25, 28 as the Bretton Woods type 2, or Smoot-Hawley, the status quo moment?
That's right. No, things don't go back to normal. We are changed. This is the point about trust. Once you've destroyed trust, it doesn't come back easily. And you just talk to any of the Europeans, you hear that. Right? So you see it publicly, by the way, once it's in secrets. So and that's the first point. Trump has made the old irrelevant, and whoever takes over from Trump, whether a Democrat or Republican, will remain with quite a bit of it. It's really hard to remove. Smoot already tells you it's quite hard to remove a tariff once you've got it in place, right? You've created a whole bunch of lobbyists and kind of interest around that, which is why we shouldn't have them in New Zealand, of course. So that's the first point I make. So Trump is going to change things and things won't settle back. So don't think that somehow, if only we waited out and put on the raincoat, we'll be back to the races. No, we won't. Second point I'd make is we weren't back at the races anyway. The global trading system was already under intense stress. We already didn't have a disputes resolution procedure at the WTO before Trump. We already had Obama walking away from CPTPP until the very end. We already had Biden with highly protectionist things like the CHIPS Act and so on. We already had the Europeans practicing in some cases, economic coercion. We already had the Chinese practicing economic coercion with the likes of Australia. So the world was already changing around us. All that Trump's done has kind of exploded and accelerated it. And of course, he's done it in a very public way that feels quite discombobulating. But I suspect we would have reached a crunch point anyway, the global trading system where we now have. And that could be good for New Zealand, actually. Like I say, if you only think differently about what the opportunities now are, then it's probably pretty good. I was just talking to the Indonesians 2 nights ago. Last night. Last night I was on the phone to the Indonesians. KDIN, the big Indonesian business organisation, massive organisation, big friends of New Zealand. The Indonesians are in the process of joining the OECD, if you don't know that, right? Massive. It'll take years to do it. That's the biggest economy, one of the biggest economies in the world, likely to be a G5, I suspect, by 2030, 2035. They want to join the OECD. They want to join our rules-based system. Why is that? They say they want investment. They want to be wealthy. They want to be developed. I say, brilliant. Love your work. How can I help, right? Now, when you talk to them, what are they interested in? They're interested in following the rules. They say, what are the rules we need to follow to do this thing, including WTO rules, right? Now, this is the same OECD, this is the same Indonesia that sometimes doesn't do that. But you get the idea, right? The world is not necessarily saying, oh, it's all over. Throw it all away, start again. It's not happening, actually. We're reglobalising. We're going to think differently about these opportunities, and they are massive for us, if only we can understand that.
Phil, you just in talking about Southeast Asia, you identified India and Vietnam as opportunities. What do you think the scarce New Zealand capability is that stop firms from acting on those opportunities? Is it language? Is it management bandwidth, risk capital, government relationships, product markets, patient capital, ambition?
Yes, all of those. So when you think about, a good example of this is China. When the point I make about so important for the business and government communities to get together on these things. When the China deal was done, I think in the year 2000, I was chief executive of Business New Zealand at the time. The deal was done. And Helen Clark, I recall, the early doors of the China relationship, nothing much happened. You might recall this. And Helen Clark, I recall, said, we've opened the door. Why doesn't business walk through it? Well, the reason business wasn't walking through it felt very complicated, right? The New Zealand business community over the last 50 odd years had dealt largely with countries that looked like New Zealand, European Union, Australia, Singapore, Japan, to some extent Korea. And so all of a sudden we were now dealing with a world that was very, very different for us. China. That's really different, right? Latin America feels quite different, unless you start getting into it, right? And so there was a hesitation about the business community to get in there. Oh, it's going to be corrupt over, they're going to steal my IP, all of the slogans that you hear, right? Now, no big business doesn't have something to do with China because we matured the relationship, and that took time, and it took a lot of government and business cooperation. I recall Helen Clark getting the message that she needed to lean in. We did all the trade missions, and I remember John Key carrying that on. I recall seeing, I think John Key saw Xi more in 1 year than I think the UK Prime Minister did. It's extraordinary stuff at the time. I may have that wrong, but you get the idea. It was massive. I think I sure was with key twice in a year. That's massive, right? So we need to think about new markets in that way too. We need to make choices about what we're going to do and not expect somehow you just turn up on a plane in Hanoi and get things done. We need to have a product view, a view about that, which is why I say we need to get best and brightest in this room and elsewhere to say, okay, if we're going to focus on Vietnam, what I would suggest we do, what is it about Vietnam? Let's go back and talk to the business community about that. Let's run some trade missions up there. Let's understand what the opportunities are. Have we got our best and brightest ambassadors and NZTE people there? Are we doing research on what's going on there to excite the business community to go there and do business? Because I can tell you, from personal experience, once you get there and you spend time, they're up for it. They love you. They're going to want to do business with you.
Right, thanks. Do you have a question here? Hi. To the mic.
Kia ora, Phil. Jeff Bilborough from Luminite. My question's about how do you get long-term thinking in New Zealand? Because you started by saying the long-run leaders of public policy in New Zealand are the officials that we have. Yet we are bound by this 3-year cycle. The current Public Service Act, the bill amendment that's before Parliament at the moment, is doing away with long-term impact briefings across all of them, just one centralised by DPMC. The new regulatory standards bill asks departments to put out a 12-month plan on what their regulation and legislation may be, but it's only 12 months. The LTIB was designed to be trans-government, trans-political parties. How are we going to get the long-term thinking that you set out before us, those 6 steps, into the systems that we have at the moment?
My experience of the public service in New Zealand is like this. Contains some of the most capable, intelligent and inspiring people I've ever met. And it contains some people who are useless. In other words, I've just described any big bureaucracy, private or public sector. I used to work for Westpac Bank, same, right? Any big bureaucracy like that, right? What we need to do in New Zealand as a public service, I think, not one of it, but one who's very close to it, any public servant in the room, and I'm a big friend. I think we need to allocate the brains internally in agencies to these challenges, because I actually think once you get the facts and the detail and the analysis to any politician, broadly speaking, they'll get it. And I think that you need to describe that. We tell our clients this actually. You need to describe opportunities that you see in language that will work with the audience that you're talking to. And I don't think that's beyond us actually. It would worry me if a lot of our thinking about how to think about these things was 40 years old and we haven't changed it. And some of the things that are 40 years old and we haven't changed are great. Regulatory responsibilities and fiscal responsibility, that's very important. Independence of the Reserve Bank, well, that's important. But when I think about microeconomic business policy, we do need to change. And I think despite all of those things, I agree, I get worried about some of those things too. Some of them are a response to what's been going on. I think senior people inside the public service need to allocate best and brightest minds to some of this, come up with information that's usable both publicly and by politicians, and then we'll get pressure for change. Because that's the other point I made up there. We need to explain this to the public. We don't do a very good job of that. I try, and so I know some officials try, but it's quite hard to do that. I think we need to take much more of an outwards approach. Hence, I welcome this kind of thing and more of it. So it's not perfect, but I think we can get there. I've seen it happen in the past. I saw us align around China. I saw us align around change we've aligned around change, I think, to the past. It requires bravery amongst officials, and not political bravery about telling the world as they see it. That's the bravery. I'm not talking about political alignment. If we can do a bit more of that, we'd be happy. I think it'll move things forward.
Well, I think you've touched on this just in your answer, but I'll just see if you want to say anything more, because one of the questions was what strategies could be used to break institutional lock-in in the New Zealand public sector, especially where entrenched norms and long-established ways of working, often described as soft institutions, reinforces the preference for the status quo. So is there anything more you want to add?
One other thought I'd give you is this happens in trade negotiations. This plus MFAT, plus MPI, plus MB, and we'll get a team together to negotiate a deal. We should do more of that when thinking about the future. We should put bright government officials, and maybe you're doing this now, but I'm not aware of it. So if I'm not aware of it, then nobody is. Saying if we think about India as an opportunity, what about a cross-agency conversation around that, so that I know that there's some work going on about that. It's time bound. We're going to spend 6 months doing that, and then we're going to make a report, and off we go. Similarly, if we think about tech, you can't leave that all to MB. You need, other people need to lean into that. So I think there's a real opportunity for more cross-agency collaboration. You see some of it, so I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it tends to happen once again on Tuesday between 2 and 4. It's not a central part. It's not a core part of what we tend to think about. I think that would unlock quite a bit about the opportunities.
In similar trend, I think, the interesting question, how do you think we move forward in terms of becoming a larger global player while still maintaining our commitment to preserving the environment and te reti?
Yeah, we need to bring New Zealand to the table, right? So I didn't mention Maori business or Treasury up there because it was an explanation of what the global business is telling me, not what I'm telling global business. But one of the things that I know to be true is that when I mention it, everybody nods, and that is the nature of New Zealand itself. So at the most shallow level, what I know is as I make this joke to people, when I walk around the world talking to the people I talk to, global business leaders and so on, senior officials and government people, I've only ever met 2 types of people when it comes to New Zealand. Those who want to come to New Zealand, number one. Secondly, those who've been to New Zealand want to come back. I never hear, I'd rather be in Belgium. That's not the case, okay? So New Zealand is this unburnished jewel, and they keep on saying, I'd love to get, I say, it's just a bad night's sleep. Don't worry about it. But of course, they never come. Well, they come once and so on, right? Now, allied to that is not just our scenery. Allied to that is the people of New Zealand. And I put the iwi piece into that as well, right? So it's the people of New Zealand. And most international people would not know what te reti means, but they understand that the point that we are a successful society, largely, I mean, we have our problems, of course, but compared to many, we're successful. And we tend to rub up against each other pretty well, and we can go to market in this trusted way. So when I think about that, I think that's a second tier issue, because it's not how we get in the door, but it is how we stay there. It's how we express ourselves. In terms of should we stay here, because if the question is traveling is a very climate heavy problem and so on, I'll argue that actually what we're doing to travel and get out there is dwarfed in terms of the opportunity we have for things like green technology, so on. So when I fly a lot, obviously my point is I think I can do much more in being in a room talking about what New Zealand's doing on climate, for example, or what we're doing about biodiversity, and that encourages other action that vastly dwarfs anything we're doing on the act of flying. So we need to be engaged. One thing I've noticed, by the way, since COVID, is New Zealand was almost uniquely damaged by COVID in the sense that we were away from the global commons for quite a while. What I noticed was that when we were away, others grabbed our seats. This certainly happened to me. Others grabbed our seats, and so we need to make an extra effort to go back and be influential again. And I noticed that we're not doing that as much as we might for a whole bunch of reasons. But I'd encourage us to actually turn up. Influence is a contact sport. Business is a contact sport. You need to look a person in the eye. You need to shake a hand. You need to break bread, have a glass of wine, a beer, or whatever. You need to do it. You need to know their family a bit. That's how influence is built. And anybody who knows how it works globally knows that's exactly what we need to do more of.
Thanks. I'm going to sort of start to wrap us up, but if there's another question from the audience, I've got one great question I'm determined to use from online, so I'm going to finish with that. But is there another question from the field? Yes.
Thanks very much, Bill. Benjamin Stubbing from the Treasury. I had a question about AI. So I was wondering if you thought that New Zealand's AI problem, insofar as it exists, is really a uniquely AI problem, or if it's the same tech diffusion story that we've seen played out with other technologies wearing new clothes. So we have small firms, we have thin management capability, this weak intangible capital investment, and shallow capital markets at that, and just slow organizational change. So from what you've seen, is the binding constraint different this time?
What you've described lots of the constraints that I think are there. That's right. I think that's right. We've always tended to be, as a country, tech followers. We're quite good at being quite fast tech followers. I think that's my impression. What we don't tend to do well. So all the things you've described are true of AI, and they'll be true of quantum too, by the way. What we're seeing increasingly, though, in this world of industry policy, this world of resilience, is we're increasingly seeing responses to the big US tech firms where people say, we want our own capability. The Australian quantum story is a great story. They're investing, last time I looked, more than $1 billion. And they need to, because it's expensive stuff, quantum, right? I'm not aware that we've got any plan on that just yet. Maybe Stuart can tell me we do, but I'm not aware of any plan on quantum right now. So we are being passengers around quantum. And so what will happen with us in quantum is what will happen with this in AI will largely be, our outcomes will largely be dictated by others, right? Now, we may be okay with that, but I think the challenge we've got with AI is it's so pervasive and so fast. It's happening much faster now than anything else, than anything else we've seen. Is we may get off into some wrong stuff on that, we're going to some wrong streets on that if we don't think about it more. One thing I think that we have done quite well in New Zealand is not try to follow the European model around lots of AI guardrails. If then we just stifle investment in AI even more. I think we all need to continue to think about those guardrails in New Zealand. Having no guardrails is probably is not a great outcome in the future. But the idea the government said, actually, if we're going to encourage AI investment here, we don't want to unnecessarily put guardrails in around that. I think that's all sensible. So a lot of what you said is true, and some added challenges. And Pete Hakes, who's here from my old mate, ex-Microsoft, might have a different view on that, but we can talk about that afterwards.
I'll bring us back together and just do a last question. But as you can see from the diversity of questions, there's just a massive discussion going. But I just love this one. So, and you may go anywhere with this one. But for this audience, what do you think this audience gets wrong about business? Specifically, where do we underestimate what firms can actually deliver, and where do we overestimate it?
Yeah,
that's a great question.
Great question. Let's have another hour on that.
I was going to say I probably should have warned you about this one before.
What does this audience get wrong about business? Many of this audience has never been in business. So you won't understand often, and this is not a criticism, it's just a different thing. You won't understand, if I could just use the idea of the risk that people take with their own capital, and the challenges that has, and the risk aversion that comes from that. If I'm investing my own capital, as I do in my business every day, my house is on the line, so I'm going to tend to take quite conservative decisions. And so I don't think officials tend to understand some of those dynamics around business very well, particularly small business. Second thing I think officials do is think all businesses are the same. They're not. And this, so that's the next point I make. Third thing I think is that officials, this wasn't true when I started at Business New Zealand, but it's becoming true. Officials don't tend to use the regulatory pyramid very well. That you'll know that, there's regulation, right? You go at the top of the pyramid, it's hard regulation. In New Zealand, as it's happening in many countries now, you tend to go straight to hard. And I think the idea of using self-regulatory mechanisms, I'm a big supporter of the fact that BSA has gone away, for example. I thought it was a poor regulatory outcome. I come from newspapers originally, so I believe in self-regulation. So we don't think about those regulatory options as well as we might. Next point is, I think one of the things that businesses lack in New Zealand is capability to think about offshore. That's not because they're stupid or dumb. It's because most of the businesses that they're operating tend to be domestically focused, and most of the bigger businesses are domestically focused. And to go offshore, as I do, is really expensive. Right? I could have a lot more cars and houses if I didn't go offshore a lot, right? So it's costly to do this. I'm making that up, but you get the idea, right? That's what I'm talking about. And for business people, that's really expensive if they're going to have to go there and they're being looked at by a board saying, "Oh, why aren't you spending the money?" So one of the things I think we can do better in New Zealand is to infect the international here at home, is to bring more of the stuff that we're doing at home, so over there, because they're diplomats and NZT people, back to a New Zealand audience. I was just in a lunch with Vangelis Vitalis on the new India FTA the other day. I invited them along to talk to some of my clients. The conversations that came out of that, what can we do about India? This is great. Some more of that I think would be helpful. The last one I'll make about this, it's a great question. I haven't even started to answer it. I'm sorry. Is I think the best officials I've ever dealt with are endlessly interested in what business thinks, not because they necessarily support it or they agree with it, but they're endlessly interested in it. And they listen really carefully when I talk about why a business would do something or why they wouldn't. And they don't criticize that. What they do is they think about what the regulatory or other response might be to that, or how might we support that. So that's kind of the biggest thing I think you can do, particularly as a young official, is actually rub up against business people and learn their reality so that you can really take it into account, good or bad, when you try and regulate or not.
Thanks, Phil. Look, and I think that's a really good place to bring it together. So I just really do want to thank you for coming. I've found it really thought-provoking as well. If I was going to walk away with three things, what I would say is your first point about reglobalisation, the fact that the rules of the game will be somewhere and they will be This is not going away. We're not starting with this from the beginning. So it's thinking about what those trends would be. The second is there are genuine opportunities for this country, whether they're geographic in terms of India or Vietnam, or whether they're some of the things that we've already got that we don't make enough use of, like trust. And the third thing is to get out of our own way. And I think you are really challenging us as officials to say, hey, yes, there's opportunities here and we really need to seize them. And you gave us some ideas about how to do that. So look, I'd just like to, a really big thanks for coming along today, Phil. You can just tell from the audience that they loved it as well. So if we could do the normal sending appreciation. Finish with Piki Te Kaha, Piki Te Ora, Piki Te Wairua, Thanks very much for coming.